This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, War, Peace, and the Presidency, Breaking with Convention. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. On Wednesday night, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance formally accepted the Republican vice presidential nomination 2 days after he was picked by Donald Trump, the man Vance once described as America's Hitler. Prior to his embrace of the MAGA movement, Vance was a vocal critic of Trump. He once described Trump as reprehensible, an idiot, and noxious. But in recent years, he shifted to become a leading supporter of Trump. J.D. Vance first gained fame as the author of the best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis, about growing up in Appalachia. The book was also made into a movie. Vance is a graduate of Yale Law School who served in the Marines and became a venture capitalist. He won a close Republican Senate race in 2022, in part thanks to billionaire tech investor Peter Thiel, who spent a record-breaking $10 million to support Vance's campaign. On Wednesday night, Vance was introduced by his wife, Usha Vance, a lawyer who once clerked for Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts and future Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh when he was a federal judge. This is part of J.D. Vance's speech at the Republican National Convention on Wednesday night.
Never in my wildest imagination could I have believed that I'd be standing here tonight. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. A small town where people spoke their minds, built with their hands, and loved their God, their family, their community, and their country with their whole hearts. Amen. But it was also a place that had been cast aside and forgotten by America's ruling class in Washington. When I was in the 4th grade, a career politician by the name of Joe Biden supported NAFTA, a bad trade deal that sent countless good jobs to Mexico. When I was a sophomore in high school, that same career politician named Joe Biden gave China a sweetheart trade deal that destroyed even more good American middle-class manufacturing jobs. When I was a senior in high school, that same Joe Biden supported the disastrous invasion of Iraq, and at each step of the way, in small towns like mine in Ohio or next door in Pennsylvania or Michigan, in states all across our country, jobs were sent overseas and our children were sent to war. And
Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance, a senator from Ohio, addressing the Republican National Convention. He has been nominated as the official vice presidential candidate on the Republican ticket, along with President Donald Trump. We're joined right now by two guests. Here in Milwaukee, as we cover the RNC, is Chris Lehmann, the D.C. bureau chief of The Nation. His new piece is just out today. It's headlined, J.D. Vance's Phony Populism Thrilled the RNC. The rest of us shouldn't be fooled. He also wrote a recent profile headlined, American Elegy. Trump's VP pick, J.D. Vance, is the perfect soulless vessel for the future of the MAGA-fied Republican Party. Joining us in Atlanta is independent journalist Zaid Jilani, who has a very different view on Vance. He's written for The Intercept, Think Progress, News Nation, and more. His new piece for Compact Magazine is headlined, Why the Left Gets J.D. Vance Wrong. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Chris, we're going to begin with you here in Milwaukee. Can you respond to Vance's address last night and who Vance is?
Well, how much time do you have? Yes, you know, Vance was a known sort of media quantity because of the wild success of his memoir, which was trotted out in 2016, largely by liberals trying to understand the Trump phenomenon after the election. And Vance, very cannily leveraged his life story into this sort of political parable where the noble heartland working class was betrayed by faithless leaders in Washington. It's a narrative that is, in many ways, valid and true. But what Vance continues to do, and we saw it in the speech last night, he has the locution, the Washington ruling class, which, I'm from Washington, and I certainly do not think highly of the leaders there, but they are not, in fact, the ruling class. The ruling class are the owners of capital. They are people like Peter Thiel, Vance's big tech sponsor, and Vance himself, right, who has worked as a venture capitalist. So there's a very adroit sort of pea going under the shell moment when he talks about the ruling class in Washington. He also, declared from the podium that the GOP is going to be the party of the workers, both union and non-union, which is a very important disclaimer because the Republican Party is not pro-union. They're trying to posture as the party of the forgotten men and women who are suffering under Biden's economic policies. But in point of fact, they are the party of the owners. They are the party of the bosses. So there's this cultural populism that Vance very effectively embodies that pushes all of those issues to the side and makes the question, are you sort of vibes aligned with the working class? And that spares you the need of having to do much in terms of concrete policy to actually materially improve their lives.
And so, Jilani, if you could talk about your assessment of Vance and his this cultural populism that Chris just mentioned. What does that cultural populism actually consist in, and why does it have the kind of appeal it does?
So I think much of what Chris said was true in terms of describing the broader Republican Party. At least since Ronald Reagan, and probably a little before Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party has been the party largely siding with the, as he said, owners, bosses, capital. I think a lot of what's happened, though, in recent years is a little bit of a door has creaked open a little bit, right, towards something else. I'll give you one example. I think when Donald Trump ran in 2016, he spent a lot of time criticizing American trade policy. I think much of the left responded to that saying, dude, this guy outsources everything that he owns. He doesn't care about unions. He's a fat cat. What is he going to do? But when Trump came into office, he appointed Robert Lighthizer. He renegotiated NAFTA, made it actually considerably more pro-worker. He pulled the United States out of Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, the other 95% of the stuff that he did, I think, would have been exactly the same as what Jeb Bush would have done, or any number of sort of neoliberal Reaganite Republicans. So I don't want to exaggerate the nature of Trump sort of opening the door to populism in the Republican Party. And as Chris said, much of it is cultural as well, right? The Republicans won working class voters by about 4 points in 2020. If you believe the latest New York Times Siena poll, they're going to win the working class by about 23 points in 2024, right? And I think, part of that is a backlash to what happened with inflation, which is not entirely Biden's fault, but it happened to occur under him. But also, I think it's sort of in alignment with cultural values, right? The working class people tend to be more skeptical towards immigration. I think they're a little bit more skeptical towards some of the cultural turns in the country on issues like transgender rights. And, I think really the main cultural issue where Democrats have the advantage now is abortion. And I think it was notable last night that J.D. Vance, despite being very pro-life and suggesting prior that he wanted to ban abortion nationally, never brought the issue up, which is part of the compromises that Vance himself, I think, will have to make now that he's joining a Republican Party led by Donald Trump, right? He's no longer Senator Vance. Now he will be vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance. But, I think that where I disagree with Chris is that I think we have a cognitive bias. It's called outgroup homogeneity bias, where we tend to see our side as different, diverse. We have many factions. We have many different types of people on our side, but the other side's all the same. And it's a cognitive bias that takes place in politics and social issues and culture and race. And I think the difference with Vance is that I think Vance's view actually has evolved either for opportunistic reasons or for sincerity reasons, or probably a mix of both, to where he does see the Republican Party is misguided in many directions. I mean, last night was probably the first vice presidential speech in 40 years in the Republican Party where he never talked about shrinking the size of government, he never talked about cutting taxes, and he never talked about reducing government spending. That is remarkable, right? Vice President Mike Pence would have never given a speech like what J.D. Vance said last night. And, you know, I'm sitting here in Georgia. J.D. Vance is on a bill with my senator, Senator Warnock, to lower the price of insulin, right? He's on bills to claw back excess bank CEO compensation. He's on bills to fight credit card monopolization. He's on bills that deal with issues like railway safety with Sherrod Brown. He has, I think, carved out sort of a third way between Reaganism and progressivism, right? He's not a progressive Democrat. He's never someone who's going to sponsor Medicare for all. He's never going to call for massive tax increases on the rich because I don't think he believes in that kind of redistribution. But I do think that he has started to go from sort of a personal sort of responsibility point of view, which was in Hillbilly Elegy, which I think honestly was probably the consequence of his trauma of his childhood, right? He was letting out a lot of his frustrations with his family and his community, to a more sociological analysis, which says, why are all these people addicted to drugs? Why are all these people sort of shifting around without jobs? Because the jobs don't exist, right? And I think that he has sort of moved more in that direction. The question is, can he move the entire Republican Party in that direction? I don't think he can right now because the vice president isn't that powerful of a position. But I do think the door is continuing to creak open a little bit, and the Republican Party may moderate a little bit more on some of these worker and family issues and step a little bit further away from Reaganism.
So, Chris, if you could respond to what Zaid said, and then I want to comment, I just quote from Vance himself, writing in 2016 in The Atlantic, just kind of describing, as Zaid mentioned, the circumstances in which he grew up and what he sees as the common thread running through communities who support Trump, what he calls Trump's faithful. In the article, this is 2016 in The Atlantic, he wrote, it was headlined, "Opioid of the Masses." Vance wrote, "A common thread among Trump's faithful, even among those whose individual circumstances remain unspoiled, is that they hail from broken communities." And overall in this piece, I should say, he kind of denounced Trump's campaign. So if you could talk about that, the kind of support base of Trump, what its origins are, what binds those people, and then also respond to what Zaid's comments were.
Yeah, this may be distressing to you, but I don't actually disagree that much with what Zaid just said. I do think, I wrote earlier this week that Vance represents a potential future shift in the Republican Party, and you know, Trump's selection of him is significant in all sorts of ways. It's a way of, you know, the party has been flailing for a while trying to figure out, you know, what the next post-Trump phase of its evolution is going to be, and Trump himself, which is kind of contrary to his character, has settled on Vance as a partial answer to that question. And Zaid is right that he does represent, you know, it was striking. There is not only opportunistically no mention of abortion in this speech, but all of these other sort of call-outs to what government should be doing on the part of workers. That is remarkable to hear in the setting of a Republican convention. As to what Vance wrote in 2016, I don't want to go into confessional J.D. Vance mode myself, but I am also from a dying Rust Belt city, Davenport, Iowa, that used to be the farm implement manufacturing of capital of the world. It's now the riverboat gambling capital of the upper Midwest. And I've seen the fallout from the broken communities that Vance has described in his own work from my hometown. And it is a real thing. You know, the last time I was in Davenport, it was during the holidays. I drove by a billboard sign that said, "Need Christmas cash, turn in a drug dealer." So that those dynamics are real, and you know, the Democratic Party does bear a not inconsequential responsibility via all, you know, the neoliberal romance with free trade, the kind of BS line that, you know, manufacturing workers who are out of a job can just learn to code and adapt to the new information economy. So the problem, again, and this is probably where Zaid and I differ a little more, is I don't see the Republican Party at the end of the day moving toward these, what he was describing as redistributive policies. I don't see them really significantly backing the priorities of unionized workers. I'm very skeptical. And, we also saw very immediately, like at one point, Vance had a line in his speech that, we in America welcome newcomers, but on our terms. So the question is, what are those terms? And the answer was furnished by lots of Proud Boy placards in the hall last night that read mass deportations now. Right now, the Trump pivot on immigration that happened in 2016 is what's driving most of this, what I call pseudo-populist rhetoric. And again, not to get too geeky or anything, but the historical populists are well worth studying because everyone is talking about populism as this sort of errant force on the right, and the original populists were redistributionists, and they created a new model for the American currency system that would reward productive labor and punish monopoly capitalists. It's all there in the historical record. Somehow, in all our discussions of latter-day populism, we never go back to the origins and look at what was really the last significant mass movement to create economic democracy in this country. And the fact that we're now using that term to describe whatever it is that J.D. Vance is turning into. And as you noted, he's a shapeshifter. He uses his personal life story as a launching pad for all sorts of other narratives about the future of the country and the plight of the forgotten working class. But at the end of the day, the forgotten working class is going to stay forgotten, in my view.
So I want to get a response from Zaid Jilani. Yesterday, just looking at some of the tweets, progressive Texas Congressmember Greg Casar challenged his Republican counterparts to prove their commitment to workers by backing the union-boosting legislation, the PRO Act. In a social media post, Casar wrote, "If Republicans want to talk like they're pro-worker, then let's have a vote on the PRO Act next week. Let's see which politicians are for unions and which are all talk." If you can talk about J.D. Vance when it comes to this kind of legislation.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it makes a lot of sense that Congressman Casar is doing that, because that's I would say probably the highest national priority for labor unions right now is passing that bill. It would help weaken right to work. It would help strengthen, I think, labor organizing and protections across the United States. But I think the reason why you're not going to see Republicans supporting something like that is because it would basically be going from 0 to 100, right? The National Republican Party has been extremely hostile to organized labor and to unions. Like I said, probably the past 40 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, right? And I think stuff like what Teamsters Union Sean O'Brien is trying to do is try to creak that door open, try to build that relationship so that maybe he won't go 0 to 100, but he might go 0 to 10, right? J.D. Vance and Senator Josh Hawley, who's probably the leader of the Senate populists, I'd say he's more populist than Vance for a number of reasons, both supported the UAW strike, right? The strike against the big three. Marco Rubio supported unionizing the Amazon workers in their warehouses in the South, in the region where I live. These are not endorsing the PRO Act, but they are steps in that direction, right? Josh Hawley was the only Republican who voted with the Democrats to defend the NLRB's so-called joint employer rule, and he would have succeeded had Kyrsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, and I believe Angus King broken ranks with the Democratic caucus and supported the pro-big business position in that particular dispute. Josh Hawley finally came out against right to work late last year after defending it for, I think, the 5 of the first 6 years of his Senate tenure. Political change happens very, very slowly. Think about how long it took for gay rights activists to convince the Democratic Party to endorse gay marriage. Barack Obama didn't even support it during his first term. He was, quote unquote, evolving on that topic, right? Probably he never had that position for real to begin with, but he had to deal with politics like everyone else. And so I think what's happening here is that Labor is starting to try to influence the Republican Party because they're starting from so far behind in a party that's so dominated by capital, by big business, by the bosses. They have to kind of get their foot in the door and see where they can go from there. I mean, I don't think that the Republicans are going to become more pro-labor than Democrats anytime soon. 10, 15 years maybe, but not now. But I do think that working people can't really win if they only influence one political party in the United States, right? Think about every other big interest in the United States, Wall Street, the big banks, pharmaceutical industry, APAC, all of them court members in both parties, right? And it took them a long time to build that level of influence. And it's not, it's not a matter of, every member is with them 100%, but they're all trying to get their foot in the door and to push them. And I think that's kind of what's happening with Labor and the Republican Party right now. And look, if I was the Republicans, I would think about it this way. On one hand, you have a ton of cash from the Chamber of Commerce, from the Club for Growth, which spent $5 million to try to keep J.D. Vance out of the Senate because big business actually does fear Vance to some extent. I mean, that's why Ken Griffin and Rupert Murdoch were lobbying Trump not to pick him. But at the same time, okay, you have all this money on one side, but look, your voting base is becoming more working class. You won the working class vote in 2020, right? Maybe you can win a few more people in the rich suburbs of Atlanta or Milwaukee or so on and so forth. Or you can actually start to lean into these workers and to start building out your base that way. The most underrepresented segment of Americans are Americans who are socially conservative, kind of skeptical of immigration, but maybe not hardcore anti-immigrant, kind of skeptical about some of the social and cultural turns on the left, but who actually want more policy that supports workers and families. And I think that's the argument that Vance is going to have to make within the Republican Party. He's going to be surrounded by Reaganites. He's going to be surrounded by big donors. He's going to have John Thune and Mitch McConnell in the Senate trying to block anything that's populist. But he's going to have to make that argument to Trump, like, look, sir, if we want to be a working class party, you have to be a working class party. You can't just be working class with your talk. You have to be working class with your walk as well. And I think that would be a real political opportunity for them. But then again, it means having to shake off 40 years of inertia of the Republican Party being the exact opposite direction of all these things.
Well, let's go back to J.D. Vance's RNC speech last night here in Milwaukee.
Months ago, I heard some young family member observe that their parents' generation, the baby boomers, could afford to buy a home when they first entered the workforce. But I don't know, this person observed, if I'll ever be able to afford a home. The absurd cost of housing is the result of so many failures, and it reveals so much about what's broken in Washington. I can tell you exactly how it happened. Wall Street barons crashed the economy and American builders went out of business. As tradesmen scrambled for jobs, houses stopped being built. The lack of good jobs, of course, led to stagnant wages. And then the Democrats flooded this country with millions of illegal aliens. So citizens had to compete with people who shouldn't even be here for precious housing. Joe Biden's inflation crisis, my friends, is really an affordability crisis. And many of the people that I grew up with can't afford to pay more for groceries, more for gas, more for rent, and that's exactly what Joe Biden's economy has given them. So prices soared, dreams were shattered, and China and the cartels sent fentanyl across the border, adding addiction to the heartache.
So, Chris, that's J.D. Vance speaking last night. Your comments on what he said.
Well, again, it's a narrative that is in many ways true and compelling. But again, note the abrupt pivot to the idea that immigrants are driving up the cost of housing. What's driving up the cost of housing is the cost of credit. And not to sound like a historical materialist broken record here, but that is determined by the Federal Reserve. That is determined actually by the donor base of the Republican Party. This is, and again, when I think back on my own Rust Belt childhood, the people I grew up with were not bone deep racists or xenophobes. And what's really dangerous about this political moment in a lot of ways is that, for the last 9 years, we've had a Republican Party saying, you're in distress, you're suffering, your jobs have been shipped overseas. Blame, people who have come to this country by other than legal means. They are the cause. And that, again, is both a cultural pivot and a way to kind of say, don't look at the men behind the curtain. That, it is ludicrous to claim that undocumented immigrants, who are also members of the working class, right, are somehow driving up the cost of housing. It's an obvious sort of I think Zaid's analysis is largely right, but I think, at some point, to really solve the problems of the working class, you first of all have to let the working class organize itself as a political force. And you have to acknowledge that, immigrants are significant contributors to the health of the economy. It's the reason that America hasn't had the post-COVID depression that other Western countries have, is because of the immigrant workforce was able to pivot and, fill the demand once, the worst of the COVID pandemic was over. So, my view is we should embrace those workers. We should welcome their contributions. We should allow them to unionize. We should have them as full participants in Americans' productive life and political life.
As we begin to wrap up, Zaid, Jilani, if you can talk about the historical precedents of both economic populism and extreme nationalism, as this coining of the term the new right with the rise of J.D. Vance is being thrown around right now. And also, remember, he's the vice presidential nominee, and who actually is going to determine policy. Today, of course, President Trump, also hoping to be not just 45, but the 47th president, will be speaking. And how much power will J.D. Vance have in shaping policy?
Yeah, so both of those are great questions. First, to get to the historical parallels, look, I'm sitting here in Georgia, in Atlanta. One of our most enigmatic historical figures was Thomas Watson, right? Thomas Watson was a populist leader who, at the beginning of his life, believed very strongly in multiracial coalitions, right? He even organized bands of Georgian men to protect African Americans from lynchings, right? I mean, he was a powerful multiracial populist. But towards the end of his life, he became a white supremacist, became very anti-black, anti-Jewish, Klan-aligned, and that sort of tracks the trajectory of what populism can be, right? Populism is often people versus the power, people versus the machine, but sometimes it has a hard edge, where I think you start to make it group versus group. You start to make it sectarian, right? And so, the question for, I think, the populist movement on the right is, you want to be aligned with the working class. I think these people genuinely do. I know J.D. Vance's chief of staff. I met him when I was in D.C., and I think he sincerely believes in his religious convictions in particular. He's a Jewish American. He believes in the Old Testament sort of scriptures, what they say about greed and exploitation. And I think he brought that to Josh Hawley's office when he worked for Hawley, and now that he works for Vance. But the question is, do all these things apply to non-Americans, right? And I do think that this populist right movement is very nationalistic in its orientation in a way that the populists on the Democratic side are not. And I think that often can come at the expense, I think, of the human rights of people, outside the United States, whether they be migrants or they be people in other parts of the world. I mean, I think Vance has spoken a little bit about how he's worried Israel may repeat some of the mistakes that we made after 9/11, just like Biden did, but he hasn't said that we should, restrict our aid or condition our weapons sales or anything else that could actually help the Palestinian people, right? And we are largely, unfortunately, responsible for the situation in Gaza now. So I do think that is a real, sort of shortcoming of the populist movement on the right, at least from the point of view of someone maybe who's not on the right. Maybe people on the right don't see it as a shortcoming. As to your second question, I think that's a very important question. Look, some vice presidents have a very subtle impact on the presidency. I mean, you might think about a Dan Quayle like that. You might think of a Kamala Harris like that, right? I don't think that either of them were particularly guiding policy in the administration. Others, like Dick Cheney, basically wrote the foreign policy for George W. Bush. So it's a little bit of a wild card. And like I said, I think that a lot of the people around Trump will be people that donors want to put in there. I think a lot of the business elite within the Republican Party really do not like Vance. They do not like his staff and who he is as a person. And they fear that he may go in a more populist direction. They'll probably try to install their people around. Trump has reportedly wants Jamie Dimon to be Treasury Secretary, who he also wanted in 2016 but wasn't able to get. Right? Jamie Dimon, I don't think is aligned with Vance on any issue, from banking policy to worker and family policy to immigration policy. Jamie Dimon's a full-on, like most business elites, he wants as many immigrants as possible. That's a way to reduce wages and save him money. So I think that this will be a real question for Vance. How does he navigate sort of not getting kicked out of the Republican Party with his views, but also influencing them in his direction? Because the reality is, if Trump was elected and things went well, Vance would probably lead the party by 2028. He would be the front runner for the presidency, and then he would have total control over the administrative state, over the executive branch, and over the direction of the political party. But for now, he may have to suck it up somewhat and compromise when Republicans are doing things like, installing people who are anti-labor across the government, when they are putting judges all over the country that are shutting down laws that are beneficial to workers and families. I mean, it is a tough compromise for him to make. And I think actually, I want to close with this. The line that he told, that you all quoted about America's Hitler, actually is slightly different than what's being quoted in the media. This was actually sent to my college classmate, Josh McLaurin, who's now a Georgia State representative. I knew him when we both attended the University of Georgia. And what he told Josh was that he worried that Trump would either be America's Hitler, which he didn't like, obviously, no one likes Hitler, or a Nixon that could be sort of useful. And I think that Vance kind of came to the conclusion that Trump is sort of a Nixon figure who could be sort of useful. But he picked Nixon, I think, for a reason, because he knows Trump has all kinds of flaws and that there are a lot of problematic aspects of him as well. And so I think Vance is sucking it up and compromising some of his values and some of his views on Trump in particular to do this. Whether it pans out for him, I think, is a big question, and whether it pans out for the country is an even bigger question.